Our industry is based on cyclical hypes. Kubernetes is the first time that the whole industry agreed what is the base platform we should build something on top of. I spent tremendous amount of time. I probably spent like 1/3 of all working hours playing with new tools. In practice, DevOps is whomever was the first one to realize that being DevOps pays better than not having it. It's kind of like, oh, why are you now jumping into service mesh? Well, I'm DevOps. Open source is the most important thing anybody can invest in for their personal careers. The most important thing for somebody who is starting a career is... Hello, I'm Victor and this is a Developers Cafe podcast.
Hey Victor, how are you?
Always good. It's immutable. You reach a certain state and then you don't change it.
Wow. So Victor, to begin the podcast, can you tell the audience about your journey into tech?
Yeah, journey into tech. Oh man. So I got, when I was like 12 or 13, something like that, I got the first computer, which was Amstrad. And with no games, no programs, nothing. The only thing I had at that time was a book written in German, which I did not understand. Eventually, I figured out that if I retype, not copy and paste, things from that book, then something happens. So I learned how to program mostly out of necessity. There was nothing else to do at that time. So that's how
cool.
I started. Then I sold my first application to my high school administration. Eventually, I got bored with... I did a couple of other applications before I reached university. I got bored with software. I decided that archaeology is as far from software as it can get, so I studied archaeology. Then those guys figured out that there is usefulness in software in archaeology as well. They brought me in, like mafia. And from there on, I worked in quite a few different companies. And now, like 30-something years later, I'm still doing it.
That's good to know. Victor, most of my audience is beginner folks who have just entered into college. So we're going to talk about DevOps. To begin with, can you tell the audience what is DevOps?
DevOps is a way of acknowledgement that different expertise and different teams cannot work in isolation. And the direction we should be having is towards forming self-sufficient teams. Meaning teams that are capable, and when I say a team, just to clarify, that's 6 to 8 people. More than 8, that's not a team, that's a football match. So working towards having self-sufficient teams that are capable of delivering something from the very beginning, from the idea until that something is running in production. We had some form of that with Agile in the past, but Agile was mostly teams formed around application developers, testers, and product owners. Agile completely forgot that there is a second half of the life cycle of application, that teams still need other types of expertise. And I think that that's what we're getting now with DevOps, right? It's creating self-sufficient teams, if I would need to describe it in one sentence. Now, in practice, it's very different. In practice, DevOps is whomever was the first one to realize that being DevOps, having DevOps in the title pays better than not having it. So in some companies, that would be people who are managing your Jenkins instances. In others would be sysadmins. In third case, it would be some mixture with security people and so on and so forth. In practice, not much changed with DevOps, just people renamed their title. But the idea is very different. The idea is to create self-sufficient teams.
DevOps is for very experienced developers. Folks who are just getting into computer science, into programming, should not play around with DevOps, should just focus on website development, mobile development, and stick to that, and pursue that for 4 or 5 years, and then think about going into DevOps. So, what do you think about this?
I agree with that fully. So think of it this way, right? To be DevOps something, I prefer actually using the term SRE than DevOps. But so whenever I say DevOps, what I really mean in this context is SRE. You need to be proficient in programming, writing code, and everything that comes with it. You need to be proficient with systems. And that can be many different things. Like that can be cloud, that could be Kubernetes, it could be Linux, it could be servers, it can be many different things, right? Starting from the very day one of your kind of journey, saying I'm going to master all of that at once is unrealistic, right? Focusing on system administration or development first makes so much more sense to me, right? Eventually, you can say my goal is to be DevOps something or SRE. Cool, right? But focus on something. Learn how to develop applications, because that's part of the story, right? Or learn how Linux works, or learn how containers, Kubernetes, cloud, anything. There are many things to learn, and you will not be considered really good in knowing all of that overnight. So yeah, I agree.
Peter, you mentioned that DevOps is a very wide field. There is Kubernetes, Linux, cloud. So how can somebody, like, what can be an ideal roadmap for somebody to get started with learning DevOps?
Again, depends whether we're talking about Dev or Ops. I already explained, don't start with both. Right? If you're talking about Ops, probably the first thing I would be thinking about is mastering Linux. You might not be ever touching which operating systems because that's becoming low level and not really that important. However, understanding how Linux works is a basis for almost everything else. A lot of somebody really experienced with Linux will have kind of no trouble. Overnight will become, let's say, expert in Docker or containers. Those are all the things that build on top of principles, let's say, embedded into Linux. So Linux is the first step that I would take from the ops side. Now, for the dev side, that can be really anything. If I would choose the language today, I would start with Go because it's relatively small and relatively simple. It teaches you how to think maybe more than some other languages because it's not so dependent on libraries. It's not so massive and huge. But eventually, if you're starting from the dev perspective, what really matters is to learn how to program. Switching from one language to another is extremely easy. Any really experienced programmer in any language should be able to switch to any other language. Maybe not in an hour, right? I'm not going to exaggerate. It takes time to master, to figure out everything, but still, it should be relatively easy. So pick one, left or right, kind of development or ops. If it's ops, Linux. If it's dev, master any language.
I know we talked about this, but just to reiterate, are there any prerequisites to learning DevOps?
No, it's just a combination of. So eventually, the thing is that depends whether you use my definition of DevOps or no, right? My definition of DevOps is that there is not such a thing as DevOps engineer.
Right.
And majority of people disagree with that. I understand. There is no such thing as DevOps engineer. What really that means is that, let's say that you and your team are developing an application. You cannot say, hey, all I know is how to write Java code. That does not work anymore. You need to understand how your application will scale. You need to understand how your application will be deployed. You need to understand what are containers and so on and so forth. So we still have specializations, right? Somebody is going to be more specialized into Java, to say something, right? Somebody else will be more specialized in Kubernetes, and so on and so forth. But everybody needs to know everything up to a certain level, right? It's not really, I don't expect everybody to become an expert in everything because that's impossible, right? But everybody needs to have understanding of the, at least on a very high level, of the whole process of everything involved in that something.
So, like DevOps is a very wide field, as you're mentioning again and again. There are various tools. How do you stay updated and how do you keep on learning new and new tools?
I personally stay updated by, I spend tremendous amount of time. I probably spend like 1/3 of all working hours just playing with new tools, right? I don't have any agenda. You know, some people are trying, oh, I need this specifically. I don't do that personally. I'm not saying that this is not an advice, just to clarify. I'm saying what I do. I pick a random thing. It usually takes no time to figure it out. That part is easy. What I believe is complicated, first, to have the mental capacity to say, I'm going to throw this to trash. Because most, you know, you get attached. You say, oh, I just spent a week with this something. I must find a reason to use it. Well, I throw to trash probably like 3/4 of things I ever touch, never to see it again. And those that stay, that the real challenge comes not in learning some tool, but trying to figure out how does that tool fit into the system as a whole, right? It's easy to figure out syntax of Docker or service mesh or whatever that something is. But figuring out how does that fit into a huge picture, right? A picture with dozens or hundreds of other tools and processes, and how would that benefit and how that would improve or maybe not improve something, that's the real challenge, at least for me, right? That's where I spend most of the time. Just learning a tool, come on, it's most of them you go read the documentation you've done in a day. Understanding it really and the context, that's a challenge. But going back to your question, how do you learn? You learn just by dedicating time on learning instead of just doing the same thing what you did yesterday, which is challenging. Many companies will not let you do that. And if they don't, you have two options. Do it outside working hours or change the company.
Also, it's very much fun learning these new tools, personally for me, like finding about them and learning about them. So how do you decide which tools to learn?
Randomly. So, but I'm special, kind of special. That sounded silly, but I went through a lot of tools so far. So I have a number of years of experience, right? So I'm not anymore searching for those that are essential. Those that are,
Right.
you know, that you're gonna be. So I use containers, I use Kubernetes, I use cloud, I use pipelines, GitOps, and all those things, right? So right now, I'm more focused on really picking random tools because you never know how useful or not they will be. Now, if you would have asked me that same question, I don't know, many years ago, then I would have a different answer because there are certain things that we know are more important than others. Like containers are a must, Linux is a must, cloud,
Right.
infrastructure as code, right? So initially, you want to pick the things that are giving you biggest return of investment. And that will also depend in big part on the context of the organization where you work in, right? For you, it might be Azure. For me, it might be on-prem.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing that. Why do you feel is that DevOps is becoming a popular career path? Because I feel that in the recent past, I have seen a lot of folks going into DevOps and doing really well. So why do you feel is that happening?
It's our industry is based on cyclical hypes, right? Before that, it was extremely popular to be a Scrum Master. That was a good profession, right? Or product owner, to master cloud. Docker was a big deal in the past, and now nobody should be using it. So it goes in cycles, right?
True. I agree.
Big part of that is a hype, right? Nobody really knows what DevOps engineer is. Kind of like nobody can explain to me what they are doing in a way that is the same as others are doing. But hypes are good. Hypes are extremely, extremely important because usually hypes have a negative connotation. Oh, this is a hype. But hypes is how we improve, right? Because of endless number of hypes in industry, we advanced and we are where we are today, right? DevOps will disappear. Nobody will be talking about DevOps, just as not many people are now so religious about Scrum, right? Okay, do what makes sense. We understood that part. We don't talk about it. Let's move on. Same thing will be with DevOps. But it's good because it lends you a better job. It gives you higher pay. It's something that is, to many, very interesting. So why not? Use the hype to your advantage.
I agree to your points that it lands a higher pay. It's interesting. So I agree with that. It's really interesting to be involved in the DevOps space because personally for me, like before getting into DevOps, I was more inclined towards web development, and that kind of became monotonous for me. Now when I'm learning DevOps, I'm learning new tools. So that's really interesting for me personally.
Yeah, but some people chose software engineering as, for some people, it's a random choice. Kind of, oh, should I be a doctor or software engineer, stuff like that, right? It's just a profession, nothing more. But for many of us, software is something that we are very passionate about, and many of us would be doing the same thing even without money. So kind of money is almost like a bonus. If I would lose a job today, I would still have do the same things that I'm doing, right? So many of us, I think, are motivated by the desire to play with toys, right? Kind of.
Right.
Now, whether that toy is Visual Studio Code where you write JavaScript, or that toy is a container, or it's Kubernetes, I think that many of us simply like playing with things. And that's where DevOps is kind of nice because typically in the past, you would learn something that's exciting, and then you would be doing that something for next 10 years.
Right.
Right? DevOps is almost like opportunity. It's almost like a blank check. It's a unwritten permission that, hey, today I can explore something else. I can play with a different toy. And it's in your title, kind of like, because nobody knows what's DevOps, kind of like, oh, why are you now jumping into Service Mesh? Well, I'm DevOps. I'm allowed to do that.
I totally relate to it. Most of my audience, as I mentioned, are beginner folks, and we are talking that DevOps is a very wide field. So, what does a DevOps engineer basically do?
I have no idea. I don't have a clue. I don't think the DevOps engineer should exist as a profession. But okay, let me play along. Let's say that what I'm saying is not true. It really, again, it depends from company to company. Really, in some cases, that will be the person who is using Terraform to manage resources in AWS. In some other cases, it will be a person who is setting up Kubernetes and managing Kubernetes. In third, it will be a person who is defining applications that will be running in Kubernetes or a database or this or that, right? It can be anything and nothing at the same time, right? And it depends greatly on the context of the company. That's why I don't like the expression DevOps engineer, because really it's undefined. Nobody knows what it is. It's different in every single company. There are some fundamentals, like what I said before, immutability, Linux, containers, this or that, but the rest, It really depends. I don't have an answer to that.
What I have observed so far is that Kubernetes is very big.
Oh
Folks
yeah.
who are learning Kubernetes, there is also like various developer tools regarding Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is a very big community. So do you feel that Kubernetes is a very essential part of learning DevOps?
Oh yeah. Without any doubt. Simply, so let's put it this way. To begin with, Kubernetes ecosystem is the biggest ecosystem we have right now. And when I say Kubernetes ecosystem, I don't mean Kubernetes alone. I mean all the projects in CNCF, 99%
Right.
of them are related to Kubernetes and many that are not in CNCF. The ecosystem is the biggest ecosystem that exists. And on top of that, Kubernetes is the main focus and the main investment, if sometimes even the 100% of investment of vast majority of software vendors, right? So almost every single software vendor, doesn't matter whether that's a big one like AWS or Red Hat, or that's a small one like the company I work in, Upbound, or any other startup, they're all vast majority of them are investing heavily in Kubernetes and building additional capabilities on top of that. That means if almost all the investment, both in hours somebody spends and in money, is going into Kubernetes, that means that Kubernetes is the most important thing today. I'm not even going from the perspective of, hey, is it better or worse than this? Simply, if all the not all, vast majority of innovation is happening on top of Kubernetes, that means that that's without a doubt the direction anybody should take. It's all about, if you look at it, I don't know, whichever subject we take, like, hey, tracing is very interesting, monitoring is very interesting, this and that are very interesting, and all the new stuff happening in those areas and many others are happening first on top of Kubernetes, and then outside Kubernetes if you're lucky. So yes, there is nothing more important for any newbie than jumping into Kubernetes, followed by cloud.
Why do you feel is that? I mean, we talked about Kubernetes in depth, but why do you feel that Kubernetes is such an important and integral part of DevOps?
It's important because now this might not sound that relevant if somebody's not yet experienced, but to begin with, Kubernetes is the first time that whole industry agreed what is the base platform we should build something on top of, right? If you look at the history, what was happening before Kubernetes, doesn't matter whether we talk 10 years ago or 50 years ago. We are using this, we are using that, different standards, different efforts, different ecosystems, and so on and so forth, right? This is the first time that everybody says, hey, Kubernetes itself, actually, let me backtrack for a second. Nobody should use Kubernetes alone. Kubernetes itself is not meant to be very useful, right? It's very basic. It does things that we haven't seen before, but it's still very basic. It was designed to be extensible, and that's the main premise of Kubernetes. It's not what it does, but how it was designed so that everybody can extend Kubernetes API and capabilities to controllers and so on and so forth. And that's the main reason, apart from it being governed by not a single company and being open source, that's the main reason why everybody's flocking and making actually the Kubernetes the de facto standard for absolutely everything. Think of it as a base for tomorrow you might, when you become more experienced and work for longer, you might choose to be a person who is specialized in networking. You might choose to be a person who is specialized in databases. You might choose a person to be specialized in CI/CD or anything. And whatever you choose to be, that something will be or already is predominantly running on top of Kubernetes. Sometimes you don't even see that Kubernetes, but it's there. Like if I don't know if you tried Azure Container Apps, right? It's a way how to say, here's a container image, run my application, don't ask me anything about
Right.
it. It's absolutely amazing service. It doesn't say Kubernetes anywhere in the documentation, but you are still running it on top of Kubernetes. You just don't know it. So yes, if you're, I'm not sure whether I remember your question correctly. It was kind of like, is the Kubernetes the thing to go for? The answer is yes, huge yes.
We talked about how folks can be involved with DevOps. We talked about the importance of DevOps, if that even is a thing. So, like, are there also any mistakes to avoid or some things to keep in mind to be wary of?
The most important thing for somebody who is starting a career is do not allow your employer to lock you into one thing for a very, very long time. That's the biggest mistake you can make. Because what happens to a lot of people is, let's say that I'm in a company for 20 years. I raised up the company ladder. I'm a principal something something. And everybody depends on me because I'm the biggest expert in DB2. I've been mastering DB2 for 20 years. Nobody can compare with me with DB2. Except that I cannot leave that company anymore because nobody needs DB2 anymore. Right? So I think that the biggest challenge is how to avoid becoming indispensable to a company and earn good money through it by being an expert in one thing for too long. Because eventually Kubernetes will go away. Everything goes away eventually, right? You want to be selfish when in your career. You want to think about yourself first. And you think about yourself by building your own personal value on the market. And that value is built through experience and knowledge. But experience does not last long, right? If you're an expert in mainframe for 40 years, man, that has no value in the market. So don't get locked and don't get... Sometimes it's good even to change the company and accept lower pay that will allow you to progress and ultimately get higher pay. And well, talking about that, one more thing that you mentioned earlier, and I forgot to answer. You mentioned open source. Open source is the most important thing anybody can invest in for their personal careers. Good jobs are given first and foremost to major contributors of projects. That's how advanced companies are hiring, right? I would hire somebody who has visible contributions to something, meaning public, any time of the day over anybody who worked completely in a way that I cannot validate.
True. I totally agree with that. And thanks for sharing this last bit about open source. Because I feel that open source is really changing lives of developers across the globe. And folks who are not leveraging it, who are not becoming a part of open source, are missing out on tons of opportunities, to be honest, in my opinion.
Oh yeah. There is no way around it. Everything that is worthwhile using today is based on open source one way or another, to begin with. And the most sought after and engineers that we have and the people that we admire, they're all heavily involved in open source. That's how you build yourself. That's how you gain knowledge. That's how you gain experience. That's how you gain something that is valuable to others. I bet that if I would ask you now, a list of 10 people you admire, I bet that 9 out of those 10 are heavily involved in open source.
True. Even 10 might be.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying to be generous, kind of like just in case,
And You mentioned that open source, the benefits. One more is that it helps you network with folks. It helps you connect with folks on calls and learn about their experiences and learn about basically how are they tackling problems. So basically, ultimately, it helps you grow in all aspects.
Exactly, in all aspects.
Are you in this field because of exploring and learning new things, new tools, because you're in this field for a long period of time?
Yeah, I'm like a kid. I just I like playing with new toys all the time. So I'm in this field, because that's that hype. That's what allows me to play and get paid for playing with stuff. Before it was called DevOps, I was heavily involved in Kubernetes and Mesos, and before that with Docker, right? There was no DevOps word over there at that time. And before Docker, it was other things, infrastructure as code or this or that, right? It's, I'm doing very similar things. It's just that today that's called DevOps. If we have the same interview a couple of years from now, it will be I will still be playing with new toys, but it will be called something else.